Hello, welcome to UGC E-Pathshala. I am Dr. Dhrupadi Chattopadhyay from the Department of English, SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. After having studied this unit, the students would be able to critically engage with the prominent debates around the issues of gender and its interaction with literary practices. They would also be able to ideate a critical awareness about gender roles and diversity, identify and evaluate gendered practices in literature, engage with the prominent concerns regarding gender both from a Eurocentric and a post-colonial context. Now, in the previous units that you would have studied, they in their own capacities have dealt with the differences between what we understand as sex as opposed to what we understand as gender. Simply speaking, gender is a socio-historically constructed phenomena as opposed to biological sex. One should be reminded that these estimates are themselves not constant. On the contrary, such socio-historical processes have evolved over time and space to constantly manipulate the understanding of what constitutes as male, female, and also the third gender. In this, we borrow directly from the second wave feminist theorists who believed, as Simone de Beauvoir would put it, one is not born a woman but becomes one. Ideally, courses about gendered subjects and or gendering of subjects should include ideas of masculinity, femininity, and the third gender. But with the basic premise of gendering subjects in mind, in this unit we shall concentrate particularly on the nature of production of female subjects and subjectivities, and in extension what we can call gendered subjects in literature. One of the important constituents of negotiations around gendering are forms of cultural practices that include visual, oral and the literary. These are interlinked practices and promote certain constructions of identity and stimulate particular forms of gender subordination. As we shall see in the course of our discussion, how the processes of production, dissemination and reception of these cultural forms help frame certain gender roles. If we are to gauge the complexity of the relationship between gender and literature, we have to concentrate equally on women authors, women represented by men, and the reception aesthetics of these literary productions. Given that feminist theorists like Hélène Cixous have pointed out that women essentially function within the limits of a patriarchal language, which is, as we know, phallogocentric, and that the feminine writing or writing as a female is always a struggle to break out from these impositions. We might not be able to find desired results if we take such writings at their face value. Often literature by women, even when it appears to have adhered to the norms of patriarchal literary production, offers insights into female perspectives and can well lead us to examine how women often took recourse to modes of subversion. Alternatively, one could also identify certain motives, symbols and themes as well as challenges to other stereotypical representations in their writings as a suitable entry point to reading literature by women. One way of introducing women's literature is to chronologically trace women writers and their works. This gives rise to problems of continuity, as discernible women writers are often sporadic and do not necessarily conform to the literary and social movements that have defined periods in Western and Indian literatures. A case in point might be the ambitious project that Susi Tharu and K. Lalita had undertaken to uncover a 260-year-old, almost unbroken history of women's writing. In doing so, they rejected hierarchies of writing that patriarchal literary histories have often taken recourse to. Unlike standard practices of understanding literary movements via printed classics, Tharu and Lalita relied on unpublished manuscripts, oral stories, folk retellings, autobiographies and newsprint. Read according to Tharu and Lalita, these varied pieces of women's writing archived not only highlight their identity politics as the excluded other, but in more ways than one challenge strict patriarchal notions about authorship, writing and generic formulations. Now we are going to discuss about the differences of, say, when women are represented by men as opposed to when women represent themselves, and certain issues that concern representation in literature. In relation to some of our preliminary observations, we can move to estimate that representation of any kind is never without any motivation. Any sort of representation, and in particular in the written medium, involves participating in the production of knowledge. Now, extending Michel Foucault's argument, we can well comment that there is an intimate relationship between power and knowledge. We need to remember that power does not necessarily present itself in the domain of knowledge in the most obvious ways. So, this can lead us to question how is knowledge about female subjects produced. According to Stuart Hall, culture and language are agents through which meaning making takes place. And, to quote, the embodying of concepts, ideas and emotions in a symbolic form which can be transmitted and meaningfully interpreted is what we mean by practices of representation. The representation is never complete unless it circulates within a cultural circuit where the meaning can be intelligibly decoded. In case of gendering, representations have often to play to the tune of the dominant male culture by various means like essentializing women, setting women outside the domain of any significant decision-making process, or idealizing women in certain roles so as to potentially take away their agency, etc. Women, in representing themselves, have challenged such representations, either by directly overturning such mandates or resorting to subverting them. A case in point might be how Victorian England constructed notions of femininity. As Catherine Hughes has beautifully demonstrated, the notions of ideal behavior for women were promoted in popular texts to restrict women to their domestic spaces. She notes that conduct books, advisories, etc., based on so-called natural characteristics concentrated on promoting what she calls the ideology of separate spheres. Women were believed to be physically weaker but morally superior, counterbalancing their husband's moral taint of the public sphere. This argument was then taken to its logical extreme by denying women their voting rights. Idealized roles for women meant that they were supposed to be what was known as the angel in the house. The most popular literary form of the period, the Victorian novel, often written by women, responded to these concerns and representations. One of the most successful writers of the period, Jane Austen, ridiculed these superficial notions by putting these ideals in the mouth of one of the snootiest and reprehensible characters in the novel, Pride and Prejudice, Caroline Bingley. A woman must, as she says, through knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing and the modern languages. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions. Almost 100 years later, Sylvia Plath, one of the most important poets of the 20th century, would lament in her novel Bell Jar that women's choices were limited by social expectations. To quote, "I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children. Another fig was a famous poet. Another fig was a brilliant professor. Another fig was Iggy, the amazing editor. Another fig was Europe and Africa and South America. Another fig was Constantine and Socrates and Attila and a pack of other lovers with queer names and offbeat professions. Another fig was an Olympic lady crew champion, and beyond and above these figs were many more figs I couldn't quite make out. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death, just because I couldn't make up my mind which of the figs I would choose. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest. And as I sat there unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one they dropped to the ground at my feet. As a confessional mode of writing, Plath's articulation captures the inability of women to break into the league of writers. The obvious biblical reference to the fig tree, Adam and Eve covered themselves in fig leaves after their fall, refers to the original sin and the destined suffering thereby. Plath is forced to starve to death as she had to choose one and lose the rest. Her creative spirit here is bound. Plath's articulation captures the inability of women to break into the league of writers. The obvious biblical reference to fig tree, Adam and Eve covered themselves in fig leaves after their fall, refers to the original sin and the destined suffering thereby. Plath is forced to starve to death as she had to choose one and lose the rest. Her creative spirit here is bound by the numerous roles that society has possibly set up for her, and a new model of self-fashioning is beyond the reaches of a woman. These examples give us a glimpse of how women often have complex reactions to their projected gender roles. In their critiques, they have constantly sought to challenge fixed gender roles assigned to them by the dominant patriarchal culture. Now we are going to talk about women and their relationship to the literary canon. As a woman writer walking down imagined libraries in England, Virginia Woolf, in a room of one's own, laments the lack of women writers down the ages, where there seems to have been numerous illustrious male writers. Working around the absence, she wonders why women authors have been historically absent from the library stacks. She envisions that if Shakespeare would have had a sister named Judith, she would have had a very different life from her celebrated brother. To quote, she was as adventurous, as imaginative, as agog to see the world as he was. But she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone of reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, and one of her brothers perhaps, and read a few pages. But then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stew and not moon about the books and papers. She concludes by observing that given the conditions requisite for literary pursuits, it would have been impossible completely and entirely for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. Historically speaking, the social conditions for women were often not conducive to producing great literature. Despite these social struggles, when women wrote, their writings were not adequately archived and definitely not studied as great canonical literature. The word canon has ecclesiastical origins, where canonical denoted divine authority. Similarly, in the literary context, the term canon came to be identified with texts that were set apart because of their literary quality and importance. By the 20th century, debates surrounding the canon came to be more defined as universities privileged certain literary work over the others, thereby proclaiming the constituents of a literary canon. By no means the first critic to have attempted to construct a canon in English literature, F.R. Lewis in his great tradition, for instance, tried to formally announce the novelistic canon in his book, The Great Tradition. Mikhail Bakhtin argues that the texts tend to move towards canonization when time-bound norms and conditions come to be hardened and taken as universal. The process of canon formation is based on a tacit consensus which is subject to social processes. Given that the politics of power has often dictated the machinations concerning the formalization of a canon, it is no wonder that in the case of the Western literary canon, it was often the white European male whose opinion mattered. With reference to the quotation by Virginia Woolf, we can well estimate that women were almost always absent from this canon. Elaine Showalter has suggested what she calls gynocriticism to illuminate the otherwise neglected domains of women's writing. In a literature of their own, she suggests that women writers or women as writers should be studied very differently from men. She introduced a broad range of methodological devices, and the subjects were the history, styles, themes, genres, and structures of writing by women, the psychodynamics of female creativity, the trajectory of the individual or collective female career, and the evolution and laws of female literary tradition. Therefore, gynocriticism does not merely intend to fill the gaps in the dominant literary historiography, but by using new methods of inquiry, possibly encourage alternative canons. Now, we are going to look at, from moving from the West to India, we are also going to look at how certain debates and concerns in the West have been reflected in terms of how we have dealt with Indian literature, how we have written Indian literature, and how we have then received Indian literature. Our discussion until now might have given us to believe that women's concerns vis-a-vis writing can be mapped with a broad stroke across the world. However, studies have shown that women's concerns are varied and defined by their own political, social, and historical parameters. Class, caste, race, and ethnicities, among others, often term the ways in which women understand their identities. A white Victorian woman fighting patriarchy might not necessarily face the same challenges as a Zenana woman in the 19th century British India. On the contrary, as political opponents colonize or colonized, they are likely to have had very, very different positions. Chandra Talpade Mohanty has convincingly argued in this vein to highlight how the hegemonic practices in the West continue to construct the notion of the third world woman. We could use such a post-colonial lens as a point of entry to understand the process of gendering where colonialism and patriarchy meet. Given India's sustained apathy towards recognizing female voices, finding speaking female subjects has been one of the many challenges that literary theoreticians in India had to face. A particularly prolonged colonial rule meant that India was seen as a laboratory for Western modernity. In India, colonial modernity has played a key role in imagining gender roles and redefining the texture of patriarchies. Traditional attitudes towards women and the exposure to Western modernity set very interesting modes of expression in India in the 19th century. On the one hand, riding on the fruits of social reform, women were getting educated, moving out from their inner quarters, and on the other hand, they were constantly ridiculed and derided for becoming the new woman or the nobina, often modeled on the white woman. Women's literature has often been associated with life writing and confessional modes of writing. Both in the case of confessional writing and autobiography, there was a greater possibility of self-fashioning. A case in point might be the first ever autobiography written by an Indian woman, Rashundari Devi's Amar Jeevan or My Life. The historian Tanika Sarkar, in her discussion of the text, points out how Rashundari Devi combined elements of medieval spiritual literature and modern genre of autobiography to legitimize her so-called transgressions. Her desire to read and write, which was forbidden by the Hindu orthodoxy, her problematization of the schema of sansar or the household were wrapped strategically under the garb of divine intervention. In terms of some unique narrative choices, she carefully shuns self-aggrandizement and opts for third-person observations about herself and continuously uses multi-intentioned but seemingly innocent statements. Therefore, the garb of a demure conformist housewife was used to launch an early woman author, and I quote, engaged in the highly public and audacious act of writing about her life, unquote. Devi's attempt, though unique, finds resonances across genres. Nabanita Devshen takes up the case of Chandrabhuti Ramayana to illustrate how urban male literary historians have easily dismissed the retelling of the Ramayana by a village woman of the 16th century rural Bengal as fragmentary and not worthy of any academic attention. Written from a female perspective without the spotlight on Rama, this retelling differed significantly both in form and in content from the two pillars of what she calls the great tradition, Sanskrit, and the little tradition, Bengali, of the Ramayana by Valmiki and Kritibas respectively. To quote, "It is no wonder that this text has been silenced by the urban literate male mediators in the role of literary historians." Shifting from generic expectations to content-driven analysis, we can also possibly look at different themes and ways of treating them that Indian women have used over centuries. For example, A.K. Ramanujan looks for speaking, when he is looking for speaking subjects, picks a popular Kannada tale, The Flowering Tree, as his point of departure. He observes that for most part, traditional male-centric narratives revolve around the coming of age of the hero, where men are protagonists, especially in the tales of quests. Women are secondary. They are usually part of the prize along with half of a kingdom. Sometimes they help the hero in his quest for the magic flower, etc., etc. And these tales typically end in marriage. However, in the case of women's tales, the narrative often begins after marriage, when the power centers have been suitably altered, and women leverage their traditional roles only to suitably subvert them, as we see in some of the retellings of this folk tale. So, to put certain points in perspective, notions of gendering have historically influenced the production, dissemination, consumption, and reception of literature. Women have argued that they have been consciously left out of the canon, or so-called the legends of great literatures of the world. Their grudging admissions into the hallowed domains of great literature also does not do adequate justice to the way they are read. The methodological tools used academic inquiry into the literary practices are inadequate to estimate women's writing. In terms of generic formulations, images, themes, subjects, perspectives, language, etc., women's writing have an algorithm of their own which we have to acknowledge, and they have to be evaluated on their own terms. Having said that, one should be critically aware so as not essentialize women's writing. Writing by women have to be simultaneously read as products of their historical, social, political, and economic concerns. Therefore, gender concerns in literary practices should reflect multiple female identities. So, essentially the understanding of gender and literature has to be broadened to incorporate several other issues, multiplicitous voices, and multiple concerns. And this is an open debate, so I am sure you would look at other references, etc., to expand your horizon. Thank you for listening to me.